Hello everyone, Santier here with my Guild Wars 1 skill review project, and today I'm going to talk about the Assassin attribute line of Shadow Arts. Yes, that's a good introduction. So Shadow Arts contains a bunch of what I'd consider more utility class skills for the Assassin, and it tends to play more in the smoke bomb area of what you would consider from like a classical like ninja type character, whereas Deadly Arts is more of the kunai shuriken sort of throwing dagger area. So we're going to see a bunch of different sort of class, a lot more self-support, defensive type options in here. But that's not entirely what's in Shadow Arts, and we're going to go ahead and launch into it with Beguiling Haze. So Beguiling Haze is 15 energy, it is a quarter-second cast time, and 20-second recharge. It is an elite spell. Shadow Step to target foe. That foe becomes dazed for 8 seconds. So I actually quite like this in terms of some of the Shadow Steps. It has only 20-second recharge, which is really nice. The downside is 15 energy is a lot, but the reason why it costs 15 energy is because of inflicting that pretty lengthy 8-second daze. Daze is a very powerful condition. For those who are unfamiliar or maybe need a refresher, it makes spells take twice as long to cast and they're easily interruptible, which means that any physical attack will interrupt them. So inflicting a nice daze like this is a really great way of being able to shut down casters. So I like this one decently well. It's not worth using unless you have a decent amount in Shadow Arts. So that way you're getting a reasonably long dazed. You want, like 6-7 second dazed. But in those sorts of situations, I quite like it. I'm going to give this guy a 4. I certainly don't default to using this one, but I'm quite happy to use it. I do tend to use Wastrel's Collapse, which is no attributes more for an elite Shadow Step, just because Wastrel's Collapse is only 5 energy. So 5 energy, of course, is significantly less than 15. So Beguiling Haze is kind of on the expensive end. But the effect of inflicting dazed for 8 seconds or, 7 seconds or whatever, it tends to more realistically be. I mean, more realistically, you're going to be about 9 or so 7 seconds. That's quite a useful effect. So really, really handy for being like, oh, there's the healer. Beguiling Haze to them, and then start laying in on your attack combo on them, so that way they are getting interrupted and they're not really able to support themselves and things like that. It's quite strong. So I like what this skill is doing. It has a good play pattern and those sorts of things. So could also be pretty strong on like a warrior or something. You're probably going entirely on adrenaline skills at that point because you do not have the energy pool to do much else, but this could be quite solid on a warrior. It'd be like, hey, I'm beguiling hazing you, I'm warping in, and then I'm smashing you in the face with my hammer or something. Okay, Blinding Powder. So Blinding Powder is 5 energy, quarter-second cast time, and 20-second recharge. It is a spell. It must follow an offhand attack. So in general, that means it's going to be lead attack, offhand attack, Blinding Powder. It's kind of your pattern. Target foe and all adjacent foes become blinded for 13 seconds. So this is kind of the assassin version of Throw Dirt. Throw Dirt being a ranger skill that's a touch-trained skill that blinds target foe and adjacent foes. Note that this is not touch-ranged, but the fact that it has to follow an offhand attack kind of means that it is. It's hard to use this at range, although technically you can. I don't know. This is one of those skills that feels like it's kind of fine, but it's like, so if I'm inflicting blind, I'm probably doing it with like a Mesmer's Ineptitude, or more likely Blinding Surge off of an Air Elementalist, something like that. This is not typically the direction that I'm going to go for it. It is a pretty lengthy duration at 13 seconds, although obviously that's probably going to go down a little bit because you're probably not going to put full 12 into Shadow Arts. I don't know. This is one of those skills that also it requires getting to an offhand attack, which does take a little bit, and it requires not automatically jumping right into your dual attack. This does not take a dual attack slot, by the way. It's just like hit offhand. You can bop into this if you want to. I don't know. Trying to think of where I want to put it. It's useful utility. I like the flavor of oh, now I have some blinding powder. I think and like they're able to balance it about down a bit by having the offhand requirement. I'm gonna give this guy a 3. I think it's generally useful. It's just not quite where I'm going a lot of the time. I am often not like, this is not usually how I'm building my assassin, but I think it's not an unreasonable skill. Caltrops. Caltrops is 10 energy, quarter second cast time, 10-second recharge spell. Target foe and all foes adjacent to your target are crippled for 13 seconds. Caltrops has half the normal range. This is a perfectly adequate way of getting crippled, inflicted. Also, it has a nice sort of recharge. It is kind of pricey at 10 energy, and I'm not sure if AoE crippled is worth that in PvE or not. If I'm wanting snares, often it's going to be something like Deep Freeze, which has a much bigger area of effect. Obviously costs a lot more energy, but it also does it's bigger area of effect and more damage. It lasts 10 seconds, a bit more slow effect. Hexes can be useful. This is one of those skills when I read it, I'm like, this is adequate. This feels like a 3 to me as well. Again, I feel like a lot of assassin skills are kind of like in the 3 range. Yes, a new build of Guild Wars is available. Apparently it's server maintenance. For anybody who was wondering and seeing that in the corner. Okay, so ignoring that. So I feel like Caltrops is one of those skills where it's just like, this is very flavorful. It does this very flavorful thing of like, oh, and now I've crippled you because I've thrown all these pointy objects on the floor. If you're not familiar with Caltrops, by the way, they look like a jack from the Jacks, the game where you like have these things you're placing on the ground and then you bounce a ball and pick them up or whatever. But they're basically, think of like, they're weaponized D4s is basically what a Caltrop is. So, yeah, enemies step on them, they get crippled. Like, I don't know, this feels like a really good interpretation of that concept. I guess I'm going to move on. I don't have a lot more to say about it, so I'm just going to go in circles if I stay on there, and we don't need that. Dark Escape. So this is one of a few odd speed increase moves that are in Shadow Arts. Dark Escape is 5 energy, 30-second recharge. It is a stance. For 13 seconds, you move 25% faster and take half damage. Dark Escape ends if you successfully hit with an attack. So this is kind of a skill used for fleeing. I believe it's been used in some runner builds. This is not a skill I would generally use. Its uptime is terrible, as far as I'm concerned. A duration of 13 seconds every 30 seconds is not terribly exciting. And ending when you successfully hit with an attack, I want that to come with an upside. So this is a very defensively oriented skill of like, okay, I need to get out of here. I can see some scenarios where that's useful, but most of the time this is not what I want. So I'm going to give this a 2. This requires a very specific play pattern that you're playing into to make it useful. And honestly, a lot of the time, that's just not a play pattern that I'm wanting to engage in. So I don't have much use for Dark Escape. But I can see some situations where it's handy. Death's Charge. So this is 5 energy, quarter second, cast time, 30-second recharge spell. Shadow Step to target foe. If that foe has more health than you, you are healed for 173 health. This is a pretty strong self-heal. Truthfully, I don't really bring this skill for the self-heal. I bring it because it's a pretty low commitment Shadow Step. It does not take up your elite slot, only has a 30-second recharge, which is about where you can get for non-elites. Elite Shadow Steps can get down to like the 20-second range, which we saw with Beguiling Haze, but non-elites really don't get below 30, unless there's some weird finicky shenanigans going on. So for like your just straight up Shadow Step, 30 seconds, only 5 energy. I don't care how much health I'm gaining. I might not be gaining any off of this. To me, this is kind of like, you just want a Shadow Step to throw on your bar. You can throw this on without any Shadow Arts or just like 2 or 3 points into Shadow Arts, which you might have spare left over. And you're fine, because the main functionality of the skill most of the time is going to be the Shadow Step. I don't tend to do that a whole lot, but I'm going to give this guy a 4. Not because I tend to use it often enough to warrant a 4, but just because I feel like this is like your standard issue. It just works Shadow Step. That I feel like it kind of is, yeah, it's good enough at what it does to be a 4. Is really what it comes down to. So that brings us to Death's Retreat, which was kind of made as a reference to Death's Charge. So it's 5 energy, quarter-second cast time, 20-second recharge. Why 20-second recharge, you ask? So it's a spell, Shadow Step to target ally. Okay. If you have less health than that ally, you gain 112 health. So I'm not a big fan of this one. Usually you want to Shadow Step to enemies, not allies. I could see some weird use case. Okay, so this is competing with a couple of different skills. First of all, it's competing with Return, which Shadow Steps to a target ally, and has a 15-second recharge as opposed to 20 seconds. Obviously, this heals you. The other skill it's actually randomly competing with is Ebon Escape, which has only a 10-second recharge. It is a PvE-only skill, so heroes cannot use it. And it takes up one of your PvE-only slots, but this Shadow Steps you to target other ally. You and that ally are healed for 110 health, no questions asked. So I feel like Ebon Escape is going to push out Death's Retreat a lot of the time. Death's Retreat is conceptually interesting. Like, I like some of these defensive Shadow Steps, but this is not the one that I want. I feel like it's conceptually interesting on like a monk where you're using this to Shadow Step to an ally and then use like Healing Touch on them or something. That feels cute, better than good, to be clear. I don't know. I'm going to give this a 2. It does do the thing, right? And the thing is not unuseful. It's just, it feels very finicky, and I feel like I have other options. If I'm trying to do that, I'd rather use Ebon Escape and not have to worry about going to Assassin Secondary or putting points in Shadow Arts to get good use out of it. I feel like I prefer Retreat a little bit as well. So here's where we are. There's a couple of other things damaging this one, and one of them is Heart of Shadow as well, which we will get to shortly. But Death's Retreat is a nice counterpart to Death's Charge, but that's kind of most of what it is to me. The other use for these class of skills is to go rescue an ally if you're like a melee attacker. So in particular, like a Hammer Warrior, if you're like, oh, this ally is being attacked, I'm going to Death's Retreat to them. But again, in those situations, I'd rather have a faster recharging skill like Return, which is only 15 seconds. And then I Shadow Step to that ally and then save them from the person attacking them. I do want to bring up that additional sort of use case. It does require you to paying attention to the battlefield and have more situational awareness, which is not always a thing that happens, but just mentioning that. Okay, Feigned Neutrality. So Feigned Neutrality is 5 energy, quarter-second activation time, 25-second recharge, enchantment spell. For 9 seconds, you have plus 7 health regeneration and plus 80 armor. Plus 80 armor means that all armor-respecting things used against you, so stuff that takes armor into account, will be quartered in damage. So it's halved for every 40 armor, so this is 1/4. So this will dramatically decrease the amount of damage you take from anything that cares about armor, which is not a bunch of skills that like Mesmers and Necromancers have, but a bunch of elementalist skills and physical attacks and stuff like that. So this enchantment ends if you successfully hit with an attack or use a skill. So basically, you can only use this to really like run away or to protect yourself. This is a very strong self-defensive option. The recharge is kind of lengthy, but it kind of needs to be given how strong this is. This is not my preferred choice for self-defense and self-healing on an assassin. We're going to get to a PvE-only skill that's a reference to this one that I think is better. And something like Shadow Refuge or Shroud of Distress are also skills that I like better than Feigned Neutrality. I'm going to give this a 2. It does do that thing that it does very well, but I just don't want the thing that it does very often, and that's kind of where things sit. So Heart of Shadow, I was mentioning this earlier, I like this better than Death's Retreat. So Heart of Shadow is 5 energy, quarter-second cast time, 15-second recharge spell. You are healed for 126 health. Shadow Step to a nearby location directly away from your target. So you could be targeting an ally, you could be targeting an enemy. Wherever it is, you'll go draw a line from them to you and keep going, and you'll go somewhere on that line. It's a set distance, but I'm not quite sure what it is. I'm not 100% set, like it won't push you off map bounds and stuff like that, but it heals you for a chunk guaranteed. This one's a fine self-heal. It's good for getting it out of a scenario if you're being surrounded. I like this better than Death's Retreat because you don't have to try to find the ally that you want to target with it, and it always heals you. And it has a lower recharge. All of those things are reasons why I prefer Death's Retreat. Fun fact, this skill and Viper's Defense, which we will see later, originally just Shadow Stepped you to a random location within an area of effect, and they were made to be more predictable later on in the game's life cycle. But I think that's kind of a fun anecdote. So yeah, Heart of Shadow, I'm going to give this guy a 2. Again, the reason why is it's a self-heal. I'm typically not wanting self-heals. As far as self-heals go, this is an okay one. It doesn't require a target to work, so like it's got that going for it. Recharge of 15 seconds is a little long for self-heals, though. So anyway, it's an okay skill if you want to self-heal, but usually I don't. Okay. Hidden Caltrops. Hidden Caltrops is, as you might expect, based on regular Caltrops. It's 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 12 second recharge, elite hex spell. Your non-assassin skills are disabled for 10 seconds. Well, that right there reads to me like this was too good on non-assassins. Go figure. Assassin has a lot of these really clunky lines where, like, sometimes this tends to be more the case on like Shadow Steps. They were just considered too good on like warriors or dervishes, and unfortunately get these weird lines to make them not usable on those professions. And this is an example of that, where your non-assassin skills are disabled for 10 seconds because this was too good on a non-assassin. And so they didn't want people to just like throw this on the bar. What this does is for 8 seconds, target foe moves 50% slower. When this hex ends, that foe is crippled for 12 seconds. I don't even like this better than regular Caltrops. That's the problem. Like, Caltrops is target foe and adjacent foes, right? This is area of effect. It might have half range, and Hidden Caltrops doesn't. But 50% slower is just the same rate as crippled. So this is like, oh, I put a hex on you that cripples you, and then you remove that and you're still crippled. Wee! Like, that's a really cool conceptual design space. It just has this really clunky non-assassin skill line, and I think that this is all about PvP. I think the skill was kind of nerfed for PvP reasons. PvE, single target snares like this are not something I'm terribly excited by. If I am, I don't want to spend my elite slot on this. Like, that's the problem, is I don't want to spend my elite slot on Hidden Caltrops. I'd rather spend it on Shadow Prison, right? If I'm going to be doing something like that. So, unfortunately, to me, this is not a terribly exciting skill. And I'm going to give it a 2 because it does work, but single target snare hexes are just not typically what I want. And, like, there are some other options for that, too, that the assassin has, and I prefer those. So I feel like, I feel like this was a skill that was getting abused on some secondary assassin profession in PvP, and so they threw that line on there. So this feels like a PvP type skill anyway. Mirrored Stance. So this is 5 energy, quarter second cast time, 15 second recharge, hex spell. For 30 seconds, whenever target foe enters a stance, you enter the same stance. This is a risky skill. Okay, so I really like the conceptual space this is playing around in, of anything you can do, I can do, sort of thing, of like, oh, I'm taking your stance. The issue here is you have to research the enemies that you're going to be facing to see what stances they use, to see if this is even worth bringing. It's cute in PvP, especially in like random arenas where like warriors and stuff are probably going to be using some defensive stances and stuff like that. But it's also really, really bad if they use Frenzy, because that increases attack speed but means you take double damage, and they can just come in, especially if they're like a hammer warrior. They just come in like, oh, I am mirrored stance. I'm going to go target the assassin. I'm going to pop Frenzy and use a knockdown, and they're just going to take infinite damage and die. It's kind of what it runs into. I mean, infinite's an exaggeration, but they're going to take lethal damage. So I really like the space that the skill is playing in. It's such a cool design concept. It's going to be hard to make good use of. You're probably going to often want to target warriors with it. You really have to research the area you're going into. I'm going to give this a 2. And a little bit of that's a pity too, because I think the design is so cool. I do think you can make adequate use of this if you do your research on what the enemies can do in the area you're going into, and you know what you're going to want to place this on. In that sort of case, you can probably get some good use out of it. You can get some whirling defense, or you can get some lightning reflexes, or you can get some like berserker stance or defensive stance or things like that, where it's like, hey, I'm getting the good stuff off of you. But it's going to be really hard to actually use well and reliably. So cool idea, but very difficult to make use of, particularly in PvE. Kind of a cool icon, though. I like that icon. Okay, so that's Mirrored Stance. Let's go ahead and go to Return. So Return is 5 energy, quarter second cast time, 15-second recharge spell. All adjacent foes are crippled for 7 seconds, and Shadow Step to target other allies' location. I like this okay as this sort of class of spell, just because the crippled means that they cannot pursue you as freely, but I'm not that excited by this class of skill. Return was kind of the OG, by the way. The original of these type of Shadow Step to an ally skills. Death Retreat was added in either Nightfall or Eye of the North. Return was in Factions. So again, this is just not an effect that I want that often. I like the crippled effect, as I said, because it stops enemies from being able to chase you. But that's really... The lower recharge is nice. But yeah, I'm going to give this a 2. I think it does the thing that it does well. I don't want the thing that it does very often. Okay, that brings us to Shadow Form. Shadow Form is a peculiar beast. It's gone through a lot of iterations over time, and the PvP version of this is actually very similar to its original iteration. But this is 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 30-second recharge, elite enchantment spell. For 18 seconds, you cannot be the target of enemy spells, and you gain 5 damage reduction for each assassin enchantment on you. So this will count as 1, so you'll take 5 less damage from that. If you use another one, you'll have 10 less damage, etc. You cannot deal more than 21 damage with a single skill or attack. This skill has seen a lot of change. So the original was basically all spells... It might have just been enemy spells against you fail. Or whatever. You're basically immune to spells from hostile sources, and all attacks against you miss. It was taking this idea of you faded into the shadows, nobody can target you, nobody can hit you. The problem that happened... And then, like, when it ended, you lost all but, like, 50 HP or something like that. Like, you were, like, super fragile once it ended. That was extremely powerful for farming. Even this skill, as it is, it's gone through a number of nerfs and changes and tweaks over the years. It's still really good for farming, is my understanding. I have not really done any of those farms personally. This is not a skill you use for standard party play, because this is not what you're trying to do as an assassin. You're trying to do a lot of damage. There's other ways that you can defend yourself, and your party helps defend you. But in the situation of farming, the skill is apparently extraordinarily powerful. So that's where I would look to people who engage in that sort of farming for more guidance on the skill. To me, this is a 2. And I'm giving it a 2 only because of that nod for its effectiveness at farming. This is not a skill that I use, like, ever. The original design was really interesting, but impossible to balance. Either it was too good, and that's what it was. It was consistently too good. Like, it was basically, you are immune to everything that's not point-blank area of effect skills. That is what the original design effectively played as in those farming scenarios. Or... alternatively, it's complete trash. So it's one of those skills that's, like, almost impossible to balance. It's difficult to kind of figure out how to work with those sort of designs. So they tweaked the design to be something they could work with more. And so what they did is they limited the amount of damage you could deal, but you could still make yourself really tanky, and that's what people do. So this is kind of like a Spellbreaker that you can keep up 100% of the time. It's better than an Obsidian Flesh, I can tell you that one. And then you probably run this with like critical defenses, and then you just like auto attack basically, and you slowly whittle things down and whatnot. So this is a skill that's had a very storied history. The flavor of the space that's playing around in is so cool. Of like, oh, you fade into the shadows, or you become a shadow that they can't quite touch. Like you're an untouchable shadow. But that leaves your physical form frail when you exit the shadow. Like that original design space, like conceptually is really cool. It's just extraordinarily powerful for farming, and they just don't want that. Fun fact, the Afflicted use this skill, and the Afflicted Assassins used to be giant pains in the butt because it was like impossible to remove this particular enchantment because you can't target them with spells successfully. You'd have to use like Signet of Disenchantment to get rid of it or something. That's part of what made it so effective for farming is like it made you invulnerable, and it was almost impossible to remove. So anyway, that's enough of the history of that particular skill. It's a cool idea, but turned out to be real hard to balance. Shadow Refuge, 5 energy, 1 second cast time, 8 second recharge, enchantment spell. For 6 seconds, you gain 9 health regeneration. When Shadow Refuge ends, you gain 88 health if you are attacking. This is kind of like the default standard assassin healing skill. Yeah, that is what this is. It heals you. And it's interesting to compare this to Troll Unguent. Troll Unguent, of course, lasts longer, but this rewards you for attacking with additional health. I honestly like having the additional raw health gain off of this. The health regen gives you a lot of additional durability. That's 18 HP per second. But if you have a lot of health regen on you, raw healing is a good counter to that. That health regen can stall out, but doesn't necessarily push your HP bar up through. Like, that's one of the things that's really peculiar about this game. Health regen and degen, they ignore sort of the normal constraints on like damage and healing and stuff like that. Like they ignore armor and things that would reduce healing and all that sort of stuff. But they have that cap at 10. So you can stack up health degen or health regen, but like raw damage or healing values can kind of exceed that. Like at a certain point, you have that diminishing return. So like technically you are counteracting, 9 health degen with this, but that kind of leaves you neutral. And raw gaining health, because of the way health degen and stuff is over time, raw gaining health can be a very strong sort of response to that. It's kind of like in Dark Souls 2, where life gems versus like something that just raw gives you health right away play very differently. So this kind of combines them in a way that's interesting. So I kind of like the space that this is going in. It encourages you to stay aggressive, but it is it's a fine self-heal, but again, it's a self-heal, so that means it's a 2. I don't generally want self-heals. That's unfortunately just how it comes down. So that brings us to Shadow Shroud. So this is very different from a skill that I ranted about last time. It's very different from Shroud of Silence. Shadow Shroud is 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 20 second recharge, elite hex spell. For 8 seconds, target foe cannot be the target of enchantments. This is a really good way of making somebody vulnerable, because enchantments are, like, it doesn't stop them from being healed or anything, but enchantments are a really powerful way of mitigating damage. So all of your, like, Reversal of Fortune and Shielding Hands and Shield of Absorption and all of that good stuff that, like, makes you super tanky and resilient and all that sort of stuff, you can't get that now. Shadow Shroud is a really good response to that sort of thing. That said, I'm not going to bring this unless that's something I'm specifically knowing that I want to deal with. This takes up your elite slot. This is much more of a PvP skill than a PvE skill. So I could see scenarios where I'd want this effect, and I appreciate that this effect exists, although I prefer something like Scourge Enchantment that punishes enchantment use rather than prevents it. But this is a great way of making somebody super vulnerable, and I appreciate sort of that space that it's playing in and how it's doing that. So that said, I'm going to give this a 2. A lot of 2s actually here in Shadow Arts I'm seeing. The reason why is just because this effect, while powerful and making an enemy like very hard to defend, usually I'm wanting other things from my elite. I'd rather bring like Beguiling Haze as a dazed or things like that. So I feel like you need to know that there's going to be a lot of enchantments that are going to be used to defend before you want to bring this. Like, that's often going to be the case, but not always going to be the case. So it feels like one of those things that's like more of an answer type skill than a skill that I just generally bring, if that makes sense. But okay, Shadow of Haste. This is 5 energy, 45-second recharge stance. For 34 seconds, you move 15% faster than normal. Okay, not a lot, but a little bit. When Shadow of Haste ends, you shadow step to your original location. That's interesting. So because this is a stance, you can cancel it with another stance. So you can use the cancel stance technology. So you can be chasing somebody down, you can take them out or something like that. 15% faster than normal means you're going to be able to catch up to anybody who doesn't have increased move speed, but you're probably not catching up to somebody who does. So anyway, because a lot of increased move speed skills are 25% or 33%, and 15 is obviously lower than those. But you can chase somebody down, you can take them out, and if you start to get overwhelmed or whatever, you can switch to a different stance, and suddenly you're out of there. Assassin has a great option for cancel stance as well, that we will talk about more in detail in the no attribute section, which is dash. It's a stance that works as an effective cancel stance. So that's kind of an interesting play space. There's actually as well smoke powder defense is another option you could use with it. So Shadow of Haste, really interesting idea, really kind of interesting play patterns, but not a skill I'm typically going to use. I feel this is another one of those, like, it's kind of a 2, because I feel like you need to do kind of you're specifically being set up to want to use this, and not kind of bring other stances that you might want to use, per se. I'm debating between like a 2 and a 3. I think I'm going to give this a 2. I don't feel like it's quite a 3 to me. I do feel like you kind of have to build around it a little bit, and the 45-second recharge is pretty long, so I'm not quite sure. Like, what it does is a very specific thing of, like, set you up to chase somebody down and then shadow step back to where you were, and to me, that's just a little bit narrow. It is really interesting, the counterplay of, if this stance gets canceled, you shadow step, like ended by like a wild blow or a wild strike or something that's a stance ender, you go back to your original location. That to me is kind of an amusing counterplay thing. But and the icon is actually really cool, of like stretching from a shadow or whatever. That's kind of a cool icon of like, oh, I'm stretching off, but my shadow's kind of lingering there. It feels a little mesmery too, with kind of like the illusion of haste or whatever, where it's like, oh, I'm going faster, but when it ends, I go back to where I started. So did I really make any progress? So I don't know. Interesting design. It's an interesting design, but it's just not an effect that I really want in PvE all that often. So it's kind of what lowers it. Shadowy Burden. 10 energy, quarter-second cast time, 15-second recharge, hex spell. For 13 seconds, target foe moves 25% slower, and while target foe has no other hexes, that foe has 20 less armor against your attacks. So, this doesn't want you to stack hexes. It allows you to kind of stay on them. 25% snare is fairly low, but, it's not nothing. While they have no other hexes, is something that you can work with. You're not always loaded up with hexes. The benefit of that, of course, and like the main reason to use this is that foe has 20 less armor against your attacks. That's interesting. That will increase the damage that they take. It's certainly useful against casters. That's the sort of effect that kind of actually falls off a bit later in the game you get, just because taking 20 armor off of 100 armor, okay, so this is one of those things where it's actually, this brings up a really interesting sort of design consideration, which is percentages versus flat values. Flat values are proportionately more powerful the smaller the relative value is. And percentages are likewise proportionally weaker the smaller the value is. So if I'm, say, having 25% armor penetration, well, if they have, 100 armor, that's 25 armor that they're losing. If they have, 60 armor, well, that's 15 armor that they're losing. It's less, right? whereas this is just like raw 20 less armor. Raw 20 less armor is much more powerful when they have lower amounts of armor that they're starting with. So this is good for decreasing armor from a caster to like 40, at which point they're taking square root of 2, so they're taking roughly 40% more damage from my attacks. It's kind of how that works. Which is nice. Like, I'm happy to deal 40% more damage with my attacks against a caster. But, caveat, that's off of the dagger part of my damage, not the attack skill, not the plus 26 or plus 30 or whatever. That's armor ignoring. So, against higher level foes, this does appreciably less. Like, if they have 140 armor because they're a friggin' destroyer, and of course they do, then dropping them to 120 is not appreciably increasing the amount of damage I'm dealing. Yes, it does increase it, technically, but they're still... 120 armor is still decreasing my damage, like 100 armor. It's still decreasing that dagger damage pretty considerably. So this becomes a little bit more interesting if I'm using like a scythe or something like that that deals more raw damage. In which case, I would potentially consider this like if I'm using something like that or like a bow maybe. It becomes more interesting with a bow as well, just because. That's at range and stuff like that, so I don't have to actually close on them. 20 less armor matters, but the thing is, like, against those high-level PvP or PvE areas, genuinely speaking, I'm going to be relying more on the raw damage from my dagger skills, my these attack skills, because that's where most of my damage as an assassin comes from anyway, because daggers, base damage level, 7 to 17 isn't that high. And even if I'm rolling like 17s, or, a little bit more if I have more dagger mastery or whatever, but if I'm rolling like 17s, that's like, okay, I'm increasing that by 40%. So what is that going to be? Well, that's math, and I don't feel like trying to do that math in my head. But you get the idea of like, that's going to be roughly like, 6 more damage or something like that. It doesn't mean nothing, but it's just not that exciting. So... I'm not terribly excited by this. I'm going to give this a 2. It does do things. It slows them down. It's a hex for some of your skills that care about hexes. And decreasing armor against your attacks is not nothing. But honestly, I think that this is a lot of the time underwhelming. So I'm not terribly excited by this skill. So yeah. It's a very marginal 2 for me, just because decreasing their armor is just... It doesn't count for as much as you think it does, is kind of what it comes down to. It doesn't count for nothing, but it doesn't count for as much as you want it to. So it's a very borderline 2, but I feel like it deserves a little bit more than a 1. Okay, so Shroud of Distress. This is 10 energy, 1 second cast time, 45 second recharge. Enchantment spell for 54 seconds. Okay, so we've got a good... that's the duration, so 54 second duration to 45 second recharge. So that's pretty nice. If you are below 50% health, you have plus 7 health regen and a 75% chance to block attacks. So, honestly, most of the time, I'm going to want critical defenses, because critical defense, or critical defenses here, this always works regardless of my health level, right? I have to keep hitting at enemies and all that sort of stuff, but I don't have to go into shadow arts to be able to get it. I'm already wanting critical strikes. This is, an effect that is quite strong, easy to maintain, that sort of thing. Shroud of Distress only works if my HP goes below 50%, at which point it is stronger, right? Make no mistake, plus 7 health regen and 75% chance to block attacks is stronger than just 75% chance to block attacks. So, like, this is a fine defensive option, but, like, as far as defensive options go, in general, I'm going to want critical defenses more often, just because it functions for me more often. So, Shroud of Distress is a fine skill, don't get me wrong. I think it's a cool design. I like the space it's playing in. It's just... I'm giving it a 3. It's a defensive option that I actually like somewhat well, because here's the thing. It's not just self-healing, it's defense. And it's also a very long duration. If I'm being pushed around that 50% health area, this is really going to help me survive quite a lot. Like, I'm going to block a bunch of attacks. I'm going to gain 14 HP per second off of this. You know, this adds a good bit of bulk in that lower area, and so this is a really cool way of saying, like, oh, I'm hurting, I'm protecting myself now. That's really cool. It's just in the standard party scenario, I want critical defenses more often because I don't need the health regen, and therefore having the block up when I'm above 50% HP is more valuable to me. But I like the design spaces it's playing in because it makes for an interesting sort of like thresholding system and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that. Let's go and move on to Smoke Powder Defense. So this is like playing into classic trope of like, oh, you're hitting somebody and now they throw smoke powder and you're blinded and you can't see them anymore and that sort of thing, and they're able to slip away. But anyway, this is 5 energy, 20-second recharge. It is a stance. For 8 seconds, the next time you are struck, you take half damage, and all adjacent foes are blinded for 5 seconds. This is a cool defensive option. Obviously, it's reducing the damage you take, which is really nice. And then on that hit, and then blind allows you to kind of, escape. It's a cool idea, but again, like this is for me another like 2. Because, like, most of the time, this is not what I'm wanting to do. If I'm going to be bringing a defensive option with Assassin, I prefer Shroud of Distress. I prefer critical defenses. For kind of this blind effect, I actually prefer Unseen Fury, which we'll get to next. This is kind of cool on, like, a secondary assassin, like a monk or something, to kind of defend yourself a little bit. But it's just a little underwhelming to me. And just not quite what I'm wanting to do. If it had an effect where it was the next time you are struck, you take half damage, all adjacent foes are blinded, and you shadow step to the nearest ally or something like that, or if there's some shadow step component to it, I feel like it'd fit into the trope a little better. Or even if it was just blind all adjacent foes, shadow step to target ally. Something like that. That would be more interesting to me. But as it is, it's just I would rather try to get the effect of blinding my adjacent foes a different way. This is not how I want to defend myself. I feel like there are other options that I prefer. So, but I like the trope space it's playing around in, and most of the skill's problem is that there's other things that are competing for like what it's doing that kind of do that better. So, Unseen Fury. So Unseen Fury is 5 energy, 20-second recharge, stance. So it's looking pretty similar to Smoke Powder Defense so far. Unseen Fury says all adjacent foes are blinded for 9 seconds. Oh, okay. So that doesn't require me to be hit at all, and it lasts longer for the investment. Cool. Like, this is the problem with Smoke Powder Defense, right? Unseen Fury does the principal part of it of blinding all adjacent foes without me having to be hit and for a longer duration. Plus, it comes with additional. For 26 seconds, you cannot be blocked by blinded foes. Oh, well, that's a nice additional benefit. So I like this one reasonably well. I'm going to give this one a 3. The reason why is, like, okay, it has this blinded effect, but it also has this anti-blocking effect. And that anti-blocking effect is also really nice. 3 is maybe a little generous for it. It's kind of more of a high 2. But I'm going to give it a 3 just because I like it a bit. Certainly, like, so it's combining 2 useful things, one of which is blinding enemies. That's always useful for decreasing damage that they deal. And the other thing that it does that's really nice, obviously, is it allows you to have your attacks not be blocked. It does require you to be blinding those foes. You could potentially bring other blind, but this is a nice little package. And it plays nicely also with blinding powder, so you can blinding powder to spread some more blind around. Unseen Fury, of course, does have 100% uptime. 26 seconds duration on 20-second recharge. You can keep it up all the time. And prevent yourself from being blocked by blinded foes. So all you have to do is make sure that you're getting your foes blinded, which you can work with. And obviously it triggers itself. So this can work nicely in different scenarios, and here's the thing, it works with a secondary assassin too, so you can go into shadow arts on like a warrior or a dervish or something like that, and in order to get unblockability. The other thing that's really interesting to me with this is if you're running this on specifically a ranger to get unblockability with like an assassin, or not an assassin, with like an elementalist using Blinding Surge to spread blind around. That would allow you to be able to get unblockability on a ranger that way. So this actually has a number of different applications in that regard, and I think that's really interesting. So I think the skill is a little bit more universally applicable and useful in that regard than it may seem on first blush because of the secondary assassin thing. So I think it's a cool skill. Viper's Defense. So this is 5 energy, quarter second activation time, 10-second recharge spell. All adjacent foes are poisoned for 17 seconds. Shadow step to a nearby location directly away from your target. So this is very similar to, where is it? Heart of Shadow. Heart of Shadow, of course, heals you, but has a bit of a longer recharge. I actually prefer Viper's Defense. Not only does it have that shorter recharge, but I kind of prefer poisoning my foes than healing myself. This is usually because I have healers on my party. If I'm doing something where it's trying to be a little bit more independent with healing, I actually prefer something like Shadow Refuge anyway. I'm going to give Viper's Defense a 3. I like the general space that it's playing around in. It's a nice pseudo-defensive option, but you can also target like an ally behind you to move closer to enemies. Like I mentioned with, and I think I mentioned it when I was talking about Heart of Shadow. That was a skill, right? Yeah, Heart of Shadow. This used to originally shadow step you to a random location within an area of effect around you. Now it's a lot more reliable, a lot more controllable. But in general, I prefer inflicting poison to damage enemies than I do healing myself, just because I'm usually relying on other members of my party to heal me. So, Viper's Defense is playing in a fine territory. So, Way of Perfection. Way of Perfection is 5 energy, quarter second cast time, 30-second recharge, enchantment spell. For 60 seconds, whenever you successfully land a critical hit, you gain 34 health. I like this one reasonably well. Obviously, it pairs nicely with something like critical defenses to give you additional support of healing for the hits and whatnot that you do take, or like the spells that damage you or whatever. This isn't like every attack heals you. That's just not how this works. You need, like, you're not always landing critical hits, right? But I like this one reasonably well. It has a very long duration. Like, here's the thing. Like, self-healing is... Skills that are dedicated to self-healing have to, like, be in certain places. And I know that this is basically a self-healing skill. But this is, like, incidental healing that keeps your health high, as opposed to a skill that's dedicated to trying to restore chunks of health now. So this has a lot of healing potential over that course of 60 seconds with a very low investment overall. And that's part of why I like this. This is not the skill that I use to get my health up. This is the skill that I use to keep my health up. And that, to me, is much more useful and much more interesting. That's the sort of thing that relieves burden from my healers. And while technically a skill like Heart of Shadow does heal me and therefore remove some of the healing burden from my healers, and, like, to be clear, there is utility to taking healing responsibility and putting it on yourself, because they can only focus on doing one thing at a time. They can't, like, heal multiple people at once unless it's specifically a skill that heals multiple people at once. So, like, that sort of, like, spreading healing around can actually add a lot of resilience to a party. But unless I'm specifically going for that, you know. But something like Way of Perfection, it takes care of, like, low-grade damage, like incidental hits and things like that, in a way that's really useful and really nice for keeping my HP up. I'm not always going to bring it, of course, but this is one of those skills I tend to bring a bit more often from this attribute line, so I'm going to give this a 4. Just because of that. I'm not quite sure it's strong enough for that, but I just thought it was really important to kind of, like, this is healing, that's incidental healing, that keeps your HP up, that doesn't require you to disengage in order to get it. Like, something like Healing Signet requires you to step out of battle to heal yourself. Shadow Refuge is kind of like stepping back. This, you're just attacking and you're healing yourself. And so that's the sort of effect that I like. for sort of these self-healing things. Like, this is self-healing, but it feels like it's more spread out, it's more effective, it's more incidental, it helps keep my health bar up. So it's just kind of interesting. And to some extent, I'm analyzing, like, why do I like Way of Perfection over something like Shadow Refuge? And I think it's just that, like, it kind of sits there and keeps me healed rather than, like, specifically seeking out to be healed. But it is kind of a personal preference thing a little bit, I think. So that's interesting to think about, and I'm going to have to think about that for a while to kind of analyze that in more detail. But, you know, that's part of why I'm doing this, to kind of evaluate my own biases in terms of the skills that I like and why and all that sort of stuff. And this is a spot where I've had to face that, so... Okay, well, let's just go ahead and move on here. Way of the Fox. This is 5 energy, quarter second cast time, 45 second recharge. Enchantment spell for 30 seconds. Your next 5 attacks cannot be blocked. Okay. There are a lot of ways that the assassin can avoid being blocked. This is one of the least exciting of them. There is the elite in Dagger Mastery that just straight up does it. There is Unseen Fury that allows me to avoid being blocked. There is Exposed Defenses that allows me to avoid being blocked, and I don't even like that one very much. Way of the Fox is 45 second recharges is super long. Yes, any profession can go ahead and use this one to get unblockability on their next several attacks. Every profession has ways of preventing blocking from affecting them in some way. I guess Dervish maybe would appreciate this a little bit more. Like, warriors have Warrior's Cunning. That's arguably preferable to this. I guess Rangers could theoretically make use of this, but, like, my point is, like, I feel like there's other options. Way of the Fox, to me, is a very poor way of stopping being blocked. And if blocking is such a big problem, deal with the thing that's causing you to be blocked, or, like, bring Rigor Mortis Necro or something. Unseen Fury is definitely a better choice, in my opinion, than Way of the Fox. So I'm going to give this guy a 1. For the 45 frickin' second recharge, this is not how I want to be avoiding getting blocked. So yeah, no thank you. This is not for me. I do feel like this skill is in a difficult position, because it's trying to be, like, Fox's Promise is basically the elite version of this in the attribute line that you want it in more, with better uptime. This is trying to play in a very difficult spot, and I'm not sure that this is a skill that's going to ever really be able to be adequate, if that makes any sense. So, unfortunately, it's just in a really hard spot to be a successful skill, and that's what it really comes down to with it. So, Way of the Lotus, 5 energy, quarter second activation time, 20 second recharge. If you guessed that Lotus had something to do with energy, you would be right. It is an enchantment spell for 20 seconds. The next time you hit with a dual attack skill, you gain 17 energy. So this is a net 12 energy gain. It doesn't take up your elite slot, but there's other options that you can do for energy management that I prefer. Critical Strike, for example. Technically, this works if you're trying to do some sort of, like, chain with enchantments, but I'm not terribly excited by this one. I'm going to give it a 2. I think the whole playing around with, like, oh, we care about dual attacks, trigger off of using dual attacks. Space is an interesting one to play around in. Energy gain is certainly useful, but I don't know what build wants Way of the Lotus necessarily. Because here's the thing, if you want Way of the Lotus, why aren't you just using Critical Strikes? Or Critical Strike. That's my question. Like, that also gains you energy, or, like, one of the Lotus skills, right? Lotus attacks. I don't know why you're using Way of the Lotus to do this. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So, it does do a thing, but is that thing useful? I don't really think so. Just because I think that there are other ways to get that effect. So, anyway, I am, like, yeah, just think about what sort of redundancy you're making and what's going to be the preferable options, I guess, is a lesson from the skill. Anyway, I should go ahead and wrap up here because I am done with all the skills in Shadow Arts. So next time, we're going to be talking about PvE only skills and no attribute. And until then, everyone, take care. Goodbye.